Good day to you. You know, when you walk around campus around East Stroudsburg University, you may just think of yourself as one person, one student walking around, going through your routine, taking your classes, taking your exams, and then going home. But actually, you're much more. You're part of a big organization. You're part of an entire structure here that consists of a bunch of parts with a hierarchy and certain people having say over other people. And by the time that you've left here, you've been through an organization. And so that is what we're taking on today. We're actually taking on a new kind of an analysis. Last time we did Marxist analysis, and today we're taking on this next chapter. It's our third chapter, and this one is on organizational analysis, and it takes a look at mass media, media communication, media content, mass communication. It looks at it from an entirely different perspective. Maybe I shouldn't say entirely, but it looks at media from a very different perspective than Marxism, although you can still find some tie-in. So essentially, when we're looking at a piece of media communication, a piece of media content, a piece of mass communication according to an organizational analysis, what we were trying to look at is the structures and the processes and the conventions that take place within that organization. Structures, processes, conventions. So for example, if you want to take a class here at ESU, there's a whole structure. You have to take certain classes before you take other classes. Those first classes are called prerequisite. By the time you get to be a senior, you're taking those senior seminar type classes. There's a structure, right? You're a freshman first, before you are a sophomore, before you're a junior, and you're a senior. There's a structure. But there are also processes here at ESU. The process that you use to apply for financial aid involves first filling out a FAFSA form. The process that involves registering for classes here first involves meeting with an advisor and getting a PIN number. We have processes like these and others. And then conventions. Conventions refer to the ways that things are done out of history and out of culture and out of tradition. Moving on over to media as an example, if we look at radio in the United States, we have a convention of top 40 radio, meaning it's fast-paced, it's playing the top hits, the top 40 to be exact. It has a disc jockey that's full of life, running contests. That is the way that we do radio in the United States in a large sense. Those are our most popular stations. So it's an example of a convention. Like nobody says we have to do it. It's just the way that we become accustomed to doing things. So that's what we're looking at with organizational analysis. And now let's go to organizational theory to set things up. And we want to point out right away that work in the United States is just a central feature of our culture. I mean, we have the Puritan ethic, right? You got to work hard to earn what you want in life. That's how you get happiness, by working hard. And we work a lot in the United States. In fact, the average European citizen is finishing their work in the middle of October with how many days they get off, and the Americans are working on to the rest of the year. That's how much more we work, at least on the clock, than Europeans. And to put it in numbers, the average American works 34.5 hours a week versus Europeans working 26.8 hours, 30 hours, somewhere around there. So the average American is working a lot more. And they're working in organizations. And organizations are consisting of employers and employees. I'm an employee of East Stroudsburg University. I have students who are working for me where I am technically speaking their employer. That's what we're talking about. So what is an organization in a more formal sense? What's the definition of it? It's a system of ordered relationships. Like you report to a professor reports to a dean, etc. It's a system of ordered relationships and coordinated activities directed towards specific goals. And within the organization, you're going to have a hierarchy. So you're going to have certain people that have more power than others. You're going to have people who have more status in the organization, and going along with that are job titles and ways of dressing and sizes of offices. That's all related to the hierarchy. You are also going to have differentiation and specialization. You're going to have differences between components, like you'll have a billing department at an organization, that's all they do. And then you'll have a marketing department, and that's all they do. They're very different. The people working in one department, they're probably not going to be working in the other department. But at the same time, you have specialization. You have that department that can only do that one thing. And even though it's different from others, if you don't have that department, then you don't have a vital part of the organization. Can you imagine if the health center at ESU closed down right now? Would the university be able to function in COVID? So specialization is also important when we perform organizational analysis. And then we have formalization. Formalization is the degree to which the practices have to conform to specific structures and processes in the organization. It's kind of like how rigid is an organization. If you work for Apple computers in the 1980s and 1990s, it was actually expected that you would show up in jeans and no shoes and a t-shirt because Apple is trying to create this hippie ethic. That's a way of looking at formalization. Even though it's casual, it's formalization. In the United States, I'm never going to wear a t-shirt to teach a class unless it has a message on it that's very important. Because it's formalized, it should always at least wear a collar. So the media critic who's looking at organizational theory is trying to adopt an organizational perspective when you're looking at a particular circumstance, and you're going to be doing that in your discussion response post tonight. The media critic, that's you, in case you don't know, the media critic, when you adopt an organizational perspective, you're trying to look at the precise ways that structures and processes within an organization can then influence the content when we talk about media, can influence the audiences when we talk about media, can talk about the way that content is distributed to other places when we look at media. That's what we're looking at, but we're looking at the organization to get to conclusions about those processes when we're talking about media. So to continue on now, how do we assess communicative practices, assess stuff that goes on in a media organization to come up with what makes that organization unique? So that's what we want to come up with now. We're going to talk first about examining performance. So performance, when you go into an organization, is looking at how people express themselves, how they display themselves. What do they do when they are in front of others? How are they expressing themselves? And we have 4 types of that expression. We've got a ritual kind of expression, a sociality kind of expression, a political kind of expression, and an enculturation kind of expression. I'm going to let you read about that in the chapter. That's a good reason to think about. It's good material to think about for your discussion questions today. But the idea is there's performances that go on that you can look at when I walk out in the hallway and I see my colleagues with their doors open. That's part of the way that they are displaying their openness to students. We're not saying, hey, you got to knock, you need an appointment, just come on in. That's performance. A second area when we are assessing communicative practices is narratives. Narratives are the stories that people tell within an organization. Like the story that is still going around now that if you're 10 minutes late as a professor to a class, the students can leave if you are only an instructor, but if you are actually an associate professor or full professor or tenured professor, they have to wait for 15 minutes before they can leave if you're not there. It's not true. It's a story, right? Still going around. Stories can be personal, again from the book that you can read on your own. They can be collegial, and they can also be corporate. I await your examination of those terms. Moving on now to the third way to assess the communicative practices of an organization, we have textual data, text and textual data. So we can look at handbooks, training manuals, web pages, name tags, logos on shirt. This is all written materials for the most part. It includes graphic as well, some of which are formal, like our training manuals. That's going to be a very formal document. A code of ethics that an organization has, going to be a very formal document. But then we also have informal messages that go on. People write post-it notes. People type texts to others in organizations. Not that they can be examined always because they may be personal, but it's an example of informal kind of textual, informal kind of text that you can examine when you go in and look at it at an organization. Next up, to assess the communicative practices of an organization, you have management itself. How is the organization organizing the managers? Who reports to who talks to who? What are their leadership styles? You'll get a lot about that information, by the way, if you take a course with us in the spring called Broadcast Management. CMST 337, which happens to be taught by the general manager of Blue Ridge Communication, the only supplier of cable television in Monroe County. So management styles is something that we look at. We talk about collaborative styles, we talk about other styles, leadership styles, communication styles, and the hierarchy of relationships that go on in management. Are you a boss man, boss woman, or are you more like a colleague with executive privileges? That's what we look at when we look at management. And then finally, we look at technology. Technology is how technology structures the activities and influences and roles within an organization. Just having people work off of computers work on computers in cubicles, that influences how people interact in the organization as a whole. Having people work in high rises versus in open spaces, that has a lot to do with how the organization will function. It has a lot to do with how the employees communicate. It has a lot to do with what information they have access to. And it has a lot to do with ultimately who has privileges and who doesn't. Now we're going to move on beyond that material, and we're going to talk about characteristics of conventions. We introduced that word earlier in the class. It's a word that you may not be that familiar with. Conventions or customs and practices, right? So what are the characteristics that we want to look at when we're looking at conventions in an organization? Well, we've got motivated characteristics. How motivated are the people who are working at the organization? Is the motivation external, like money? Or is it internal, like they just want to feel good? We can look at motivation. We can also look at sharing. We can look at what kinds of practices do all employees do, and what practices do some employees do but others don't. Like in meetings, do some speak up but others are silent? Something we can take a look at. Does everybody have to come in through the same door in the organization? What activities are shared? Next up, as a characteristic of a convention, is the Naturalized Convention. The Naturalized Convention, and these are like unwritten rules, like they're invisible, but people follow them over time. Like in baseball, there's an unwritten rule that you don't throw your bat if you hit a home run, because that shows up the opposing pitcher, makes them look like an idiot. If you do that, next time you come up to the plate, you might get hit with a pitch. It's not in the rules. No, it's not in the rules. It's a naturalized convention. Another convention is the Resilient Convention. And that looks at how long has this convention lasted? It's been going on forever. I told you about this myth that goes around that students only have to wait 10 minutes for an instructor. That was going around when I was in college in the 1980s, and probably a lot earlier than my time too. That's an old convention, right? How long have conventions existed in an organization? And then finally we have the Directive Characteristic. The Directive Characteristic, and that means that what procedures are in place where some activities are sanctioned and some activities are prohibited. Like, when does an employee get a bonus or a raise or time off or a promotion? Those activities are sanctioned versus when are they dismissed from work? When is their pay docked? When are they demoted? Those are the kinds of things we're looking at under characteristics. So that takes us now to the final element for this chapter. It has to do with news organizations and journalistic conventions. I'm going to let you again read that information on your own, because news organizations are a very particular type of organization of media organizations. I mean, Walt Disney is a big company with a lot of properties, including ABC and ESPN, but the news part of it is that ABC and ESPN. So news organizations, even in a big company like Disney, occupy a big part of the overall media conglomerate, and therefore, we take a look at some very specific activities like beats and news agencies and press releases. You can read about that. But this will then wrap up our conversation about this next perspective that we're using to analyze media organizations, media content, and media delivery systems, and that is organizational analysis. Have a great night.